Hey everybody, Eric Dorward here with the Spartan Rocketry Club. I had a little technological problem recording the audio to this, so it's probably not going to be synced up terribly well because I had to do it after the fact. But today we are going to be working with this cradle eventually, but first we need to be working and finishing off the motor mount here. Now, there are these little doodads here that need to be applied to the edge of it. It's not terribly complicated. All it takes is a little bit of glue on each of the flat faces. And I've actually removed the burrs as best as I could and then test fit them to make sure that they fit in reasonably well. But here I am doing it again just to make sure. And the goal is that it's going to be at a perpendicular angle to the motor mount tube there, which actually is a lot easier than it seems. Being able to fit it into the little slot makes your life a whole lot easier. I just have to do it a whole bunch of times, and fortunately for you, I am not going to be doing all 9 of these on camera. So here we go. We're going to put a little bit of glue on those 2 flat edges. These are pretty small, so getting the appropriate amount of glue is a little bit of a difficult task. So I've used a dowel here to spread things out. You don't need much. As it turns out, the wood glue works really well between paper and, well, more paper, between the cardstock here and the paper tube. This doesn't take a whole lot. I didn't get the second side particularly well, so it does require a little bit of reapplication there. But we definitely do not need to be doing the typical glue on both sides, wait 30 seconds, and then put it on. So here we go. We're going to plop it in. I'm actually doing this kind of backwards. I'm using my left hand. Not entirely sure why I chose to do that, but it's not terribly hard either. So there we go. In it goes. It looks like it's pretty much at a right angle, but do check and do try to get any excess glue off there, which I've done here. When you get farther along in the build, you'll probably need to use the dowel in order to get in there and kind of scrape out any excess. And just make sure that it is where it ought to be and that it's basically at a right angle. So we're going to do this a few more times. Again, I did test fit all these. I didn't get all the burrs off of them. Overall, it didn't matter too much. It was more a matter of making sure the little slits in the cardstock part of the motor mount were clean more than anything else. So yeah, here I am using my right hand this time, which actually made things a lot easier. Ironically, though, I did most of these using my left hand, even when I did it off camera. Not sure why. It's increasingly difficult to add the extra pieces once you've started getting some of these in place because you have a little less space to work with. But it's not that bad. And you're really better off having less glue than more. I'm not entirely sure why it happened when I was doing this, but some of the glue kind of fell off the side there. I'm kind of trying to straighten it out, get some of the goop off the side and back onto the actual edge where it belongs. Again, this is not a structural element of the rocket. This is purely for decoration. So getting these on right is not going to make or break the rocket, but this rocket is all about the aesthetics. So you do want it to look as nice as possible. And even the finished product, once I finish doing all this, there's a decent amount of glue where it doesn't belong, but fortunately, most of that's going to get covered up by the paint without any real evidence that there's too much glue. Because it's really hard to get rid of the glue once it sets on there. That's all I did on camera, and here you can see that I needed to use the dowel to get rid of some of the excess for that one, especially when it's in between the 2 pieces. That's really hard to deal with. So that can dry. I did the rest of the work off camera, but now it is time for the fins. How exciting. So, among other things, we're going to need the jig, which is kind of above camera up there. You can't quite see it, but we're going to drag that down here momentarily. And we're going to need some of the other fins. This is all going to get attached to the body tube, which there it is, and there it goes. It's rolling away. That's fun. Like usual Estes kits, there is a template like this that you need to cut out of the instructions, wrap around the tube, and then go use the door jamb to draw the straight lines. So again, that's rolling away. I've taken care of that ahead of time off camera. You can't really see it terribly well, but there are a bunch of lines that I've drawn. Some of them I've labeled, but most of them I have not. There are ones that are 180 degrees around the tube from each other for the, let's call it the keel piece, that two-piece fin that we built in the last episode, and for the launch lug. The other thing that I did need to mark there are the fin lines for the big wing fins. And, oh, there's the keel one. That goes on the top. The big fin wings, I have marked, there we go, good timing, a line at 5 inches, because that's the measurement that I need to do. And I've marked that on 2 of those lines, and that's where the big fins like that go. That really is enough labeling to tell me what piece is what, so I don't really need to label each single one of them. However, it doesn't hurt to, so if you're a stickler for such things, by all means, go ahead. Now, the cradle that we built in the previous episode, the little jig, I didn't get quite right. It's not at right angles. It dried funny for whatever reason, but fortunately, that's not super important. All we really need for that jig is for it to sit there and hold those big, heavy wing fins while the glue is drying. So, to make sure I do everything right, the build is going to look like this. Those 2 fins are going to go together with the little triangle parts pointing up, and then the keel piece, the big long fin that we built, is going to go facing us. So that is definitely something I wanted to double check before I started gluing. And that's basically what it's going to look like. So it's pretty much time to glue at this point, which I'm sure I will start momentarily, probably. There we go. All right, so yeah, there's the other piece that we need, so I am all set. Now, I'm not going to put the remaining fins on right now because, oh, yeah, that's how it's going to go, because they don't need the jig, and they're just more trouble than they're worth right now. So we're actually going to do that in the next installment. Anyway, gluing time. These are big, heavy fins, so we're going to have to glue them using the appropriate techniques. So glue on once, spread it out with the dowel. Which you can't really see super well here, but whatever. There we go, spreading it out with the dowel. That's fantastic. Let it sit for about 30 seconds, and then we'll apply the second layer. Again, I do have a mark that I've made on the tube at 5 inches on each of the 2 fin wing lines, and that's exactly where it's going to go. I need to kind of be careful when I'm applying the fin here. I need to have the tube lined up. Now, it would be great if I could have the tube, the line that I drew on the tube, right at the cradle, but that's not how it works. Remember that the fin itself has some depth. So what I'm going to do here momentarily is make sure that the line is exactly where it ought to be. But that means kind of eyeballing it in between, so it's the same distance above the jig on both sides. Yeah. And those 3 are going to end up at right angles. Makes it a little bit easier to deal with there. So, time for the second layer of glue. Remember, it's just a thin little bit. We're not trying to do anything crazy with this. Just a bit more extra glue, spread it out thin, and then we will be ready to actually apply the fin to the body tube. Moment of truth. The good news is that the jig is going to hold up a lot of this for us. So I've got my left hand there to keep the tube from moving. Got to get rid of the other one because I don't need it right now. So I'm making sure that I have the tube balanced just right so that it's exactly in between the 2 lines that I've drawn on there. The fin is going to rest on the jig, so I don't have to try to hold it up because that's it's so heavy it would definitely flop off when I'm messing with it. And what I'm eventually going to do here is I'm going to put it onto the jig. I'm going to line it up just right, holding with my left hand to make sure that I don't accidentally bump or rotate the tube, and then I'm going to put it right at that 5-inch mark and just kind of slide it in there ever so carefully and push down a little bit on the fin too, so I'm making sure that it is applying level. And of course we want, even though we have the jig there, I want the glue to set up pretty well before we do anything else. Plus, when I squeeze the fin in there, it's definitely going to squish some of the glue out. And that's fine, it can squish the glue out, but I'm eventually going to clean that mess up. One thing that's also worth mentioning here too is that there's some of the glue is going to go out the bottom onto the jig. So I cannot let this completely dry on the jig as is, or I will have glued the jig to the rocket as well, which obviously would be bad and is something to be avoided. So anyway, I've held it on just about long enough here. Yep, there we go. I'm going to clean that up. This is going to give us the beginnings of a fillet. We definitely need to put a serious fillet on there later. But this should be pretty good for our first step. So the second fin, same deal as the first. Regular, spread the glue on there, spread it out with the dowel, let it sit for 30 seconds or however long it is that I decide I need to talk to it on you about what's going on. Somewhat off camera there because these are really big fins. All right, and same approach as last time. Oh yeah, I gotta let the glue dry. So that little thing, that brownish spot that's sticking out, is the triangle part. Remember, we built this fin, it's sticking through. It is not even remotely smooth for a couple reasons. But yeah, it's not smooth at all. We're gonna have to do some serious finishing work here. What we're going to do, remember, we usually, at least I usually, put this, that stuff, the wood fill, on there on the whole fin to get the grooves, the grain of the wood to be less of a problem. But that's not going to cut it here. I'm actually going to take some of this, and when it's brand new, it is a paste, but it's pretty empty at this point. So I'm going to have to add the tiniest bit of water to make it an actual paste. I kind of like smush it in there and just fill it in before I worry about anything else on the fin. Now I could do the same for this joint right here, but that one actually is pretty good. You can see that it's a joint, but when we start to paint it, some of that will disappear, and the joint is actually pretty smooth. So on goes our second layer of glue, and we are ready to attach this thing once I spread it out nicely. Same approach as last time. I'm going to make sure that I'm holding it this time with my right hand, and then the fin, I'm just going to, at the 5-inch mark, and then kind of slide it up. Now, I didn't have my left hand exactly where it should be, so the fin part kind of slid around a little bit as I was attaching it, slid upwards toward my right hand. So there's a bit of a glue mess there to clean up, but it's not that bad. It's just not as pretty as the right fin, which, it's my left hand. It's my non-dominant hand, so that's not bad. The important thing here, though, again, is I'm pushing down and in to make sure that I'm giving the glue as much time as possible to set up. And overall, these turned out pretty nicely, I think. They're about as close to 180 degrees apart as you can get, and they are definitely not askew, because that's the whole purpose of the jig, to make sure that everything is where it ought to be. Now again, the downside is, well, got to clean up that seam again. That actually wasn't as bad as I thought it was initially. But what's going on here is the glue is setting, but it's also setting underneath the jig, which is kind of a problem. You can see there, I'm pretty pleased with those two fins. Are almost exactly at the right place, so that's great. So I've moved it around a little bit. It's not terribly stuck to the jig. It actually got a little bit more stuck over time. But that's not terribly surprising, because that's what glue does. It sticks. Now it's time to attach this keel business. So the keel part, it's harder to work with. Yeah. Oh, so part of the problem here is that when I'm checking it, it wasn't perfectly smooth when I made that joint, and I think a little bit of wax paper or something got stuck in there, so I need to sand that off. The idea is, what actually happens, and you'll see this, is when I apply the glue and make sure that this is, I go to attach the whole thing, the two pieces aren't exactly on the line. They're really close, but they're not quite, and the bottom part, the tail part, ended up popping up a little bit off of the body tube. Now, sanding that out, my goal was to avoid that. It helped, but it didn't completely fix the problem, unfortunately. So what are you going to do? Well, you'll see what I do later, I guess. But for the time being, we're applying this using the regular approach. This is not really a structural element, although it is and it isn't. Half of it is decorative, the front part, but considering how much of it is there, this is a pretty big deal, and we want to glue it properly. So that's what we'll do. Use the normal 2 applications approach. So here's the second application. We'll put that on. That should be great. The good news about this is there's so much surface area on this piece, considering how much it weighs, that it's not hard to get it lined up straight, and you get a good amount of purchase. So that's good. All right, anyway, time to attach. It attaches right at the rear end of the rocket, so all the way back. And I'm going to kind of roll it upwards as I go, but it's so big that's awfully hard to do. I'm mostly interested in getting the back part lined up properly because I can't see that once it gets applied. I can see the front, and my initial application looks really great. It was pretty much right down the middle. Unfortunately, problems developed here because the tail part, which unfortunately you can't quite see in this, it was a little bit kind of bumped up off there, so I really needed to hold it in place, and I probably didn't hold it in place long enough, like full stop. Even like right now, it's not held in place as long. So what I eventually needed to do, and I have subsequently done, is there's a bunch of glue, seeping out the sides there that makes the beginnings of the fillet. I eventually smear that out, but I needed to put like an extra heavy-duty fillet in there because there was a little bit of space where the tail was not attached, which is not a good thing. Fortunately, it wasn't too hard to get glue in there. It's not perfect. This is kind of the point where it's wobbly, and wobbly's bad. We don't like wobbly. So hopefully the final extra fillets will be enough to take care of business there. And my initial attempts here certainly helped. It got glue farther in where it belonged, but it's not perfect. And I even make another attempt here to get that tail to stick harder. I'm going to hold it in place a little bit longer here and make sure that it's not pushing the front end, because one thing that happens when you mess with the tail end of a fin that's this long is it doesn't take much leverage to change where the front end of it's going either. So I want to make sure that doesn't get messed with too much. You'll notice too that I'm kind of picking this up off the ground and the jig is attached to it. It's not a huge problem really, because the jig is just slightly glued in there. The glue hasn't set completely, so removing it isn't a problem. What I ended up doing is allowing it to set a little bit more than this, see in the video, but then using the jig to kind of support part of the rocket so none of the fins, I should say, touch. Now, we do need to make sure that the tail is on right. We have this extra piece of wood from the kit, and it's going to tell us whether or not we have the fin at a right angle. And as it turns out, I didn't initially, so I needed to look down the barrel and make sure. But once I adjusted it a little bit, it looked pretty good. It wasn't perfect, and I frankly wasn't satisfied even at this point, because I do look down the barrel again at some point and think it's not quite right, so it needs a little nudge. And there's a little nudge. Checking it again makes it better. So the wooden piece is cut at 120-degree angle, which is great because there's 2 more fins that need to get attached there, and we're going to use that jig to make sure that they are spaced at 128-degree intervals around the tube. That's not going to get done in this video. Yep, bottom side, I do need to clean up that seam. You can see it's starting to bead up pretty hard. I probably let that go a little long, but I'm going to put in an extra fillet anyway, so it's not a particularly big deal. We just wouldn't want to have nasty glue bumps in there before I put the fillet on, because that would make the fillet far less attractive and not easy to work with. In any event, kind of fool around with where I actually want this to dry, The remaining things that need to be done in the next video, I need to attach the finish up with the rocket by putting the motor mount in, the remaining fins, and the launch lugs, and that pretty much takes care of it. So hopefully my recording audio syncs up pretty well with the video as to what I was doing. Thanks for watching, it's appreciated, and I will see you next time.